Welcome back to our 2024 Virtual Risk Management Conference. As a reminder, please type in all questions into the Q&A box on Zoom. This area is being monitored, and we will try to get answers to your questions during or after the session. The session is being recorded, and a copy of the recording and session slides will be provided in the days following our event. Our next session is Managing Multifamily Mold and Asbestos Risks. For this session, we have Elizabeth Kroll. She is a leading contributor to the commercial and industrial real estate industry. She is a professional geologist with an MBA, provides due diligence services to protect equity investors' interests, and collaborates with clients to effectively identify and mitigate property risks. A counselor of real estate and principal at Ramboll, she has received multiple accolades, including the Prism Industry Influencer Award and recognition from globestreet.com and the Environmental Bankers Association for her dedicated services. A very impressive resume. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you so much for that unbelievably very generous introduction. I appreciate it so much, and especially the opportunity to be a part of your very impressive conference today. Hello, everyone. It seems you've had a jam-packed agenda with really stellar content, and so I'm grateful just to have a few minutes at the end of your day to talk with you and share a little bit of my perspective regarding hazardous building materials and conditions that you might encounter in the multifamily space. As Elizabeth mentioned, I'm very focused on risk in property due diligence and property transactions. So I hope that I'll be able to add a little bit of value. And also, as Elizabeth said, I'm very happy to answer any questions either during the program or at the end. And of course, feel free to follow up with me afterward. Thank you so much. So just to give you a quick overview of what we're hoping to cover today, I really hope you'll come away from our session a better understanding of some best practices for both assessing and mitigating mold and asbestos risk. And we're going to touch on lead paint as well, just a little bit. I understand there's a diverse audience here today, but we're all collectively thinking about the health and safety of the occupants in multifamily spaces. So I want to make sure that we cover that. And also just some compliance strategies to help ensure that you're adhering to regulatory requirements, especially related to mold, asbestos, and lead paint management. And some effective risk management strategies and insights that'll help you navigate. These can be complex issues. We understand that there's a lot of health risk, of course, and also that these are investment properties. And so there's concerns around that as well. So I hope you'll leave this session with these tools to help you implement more targeted solutions. And that'll protect the residents from the health hazards that we're discussing and ensuring the long-term safety and value of your properties. So where do we start? Again, recognizing we've got a broad audience here today, and some of you are on the administration side, some are insurance providers, some are on the facilities team, some of you represent regulatory agencies. So I'm hoping that we can look at this broad-based. Where do we start? How do we get started? How do we start to assess risk? And so most often, we would conduct a property condition assessment, or sometimes it's referred to as a facility condition assessment, especially in a larger, more campus-like setting or a multi-building setting, something like that. So these are building assessments, and we want to think about the condition of the building itself. We want to get a handle on any capital needs that may need to be addressed. We're looking at all the facility building systems, including the HVAC systems, anything in the MEP realm. We want to look at the structural integrity of the building. We want to look at the condition of the roof. So we're looking at all of those areas. And then for our purposes today, we're going to start to take a deeper dive into some of our concerns, potentially that might be considered more environmental or health and safety related concerns. And so oftentimes that starts with the building envelope. We want to look at the roof, the windows, any area where moisture, for example, may infiltrate into the building. We might have some mitigating factors. Perhaps we use air conditioning and it helps lower to humidity. It helps us to slow suspect fungal growth of mold spores. If we see that we have issues related to our building envelope, then we want to make sure that we make repairs to that damage and keep a dry interior to our buildings. It's really important again, it's a health and safety concern. And if we don't manage humidity and moisture inside a building, then we potentially start to have mold growth concerns. And I want to make sure that we talk about the hazardous building materials that we're looking at. So as I mentioned a moment ago, we think about asbestos, certainly based on the age of construction of the buildings. Some older buildings, especially those built before the 1950s and earlier, we have concerns around asbestos containing building materials, but even those materials were continued to be used into the 70s and 80s. So even though we'd like to think they're not there in more recent vintage buildings, it's certainly still a possibility. So we want to make sure that we do an assessment and get a background and understand if in fact there's any asbestos containing materials. Similarly for lead paint, although the era of lead paint hopefully is behind us, it doesn't mean it's gone. We know that it's still present in many, many buildings. And so we want to be sure that we put a keen focus on that. And in a few minutes, I'll talk to you a little bit about how serious the health concerns are, especially for children pertaining to lead paint. And then we also look for PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls in caulk and paint. And one of the tricks with this is that oftentimes if it is in fact in window caulking, what happens is over time it starts to leach into the substrate, into the concrete or the bricks or whatever those facade materials are at the building. And so it becomes difficult to remediate, costly to remediate, time consuming, all those things. So again, to the best of our ability, we really want to do a comprehensive environmental and physical survey of the building and understand what some of these concerns might be. And then in proceeding with this evaluation, one of the key tools that we use is moisture mapping. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. And then once all this work is done, we want to be able to have a verification if any restoration, remediation, abatement activities have occurred, then we want to make sure that we provide documentation of that. And I hope when we finish today, that'll be one of the main messages that you take home, that really maintaining your documentation and keeping that in a easily accessible, readily providable format, in a mechanism, a way that you convey that should you have someone, with concerns of someone visiting your property or an agency, perhaps asking for that information. So keeping documentation and keeping it readily accessible is really important. So if we could go to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about what we're looking for. So in our building condition assessment or our facility condition assessment, we're first doing a visual assessment. We're going to walk through the whole building and observing. Again, we're looking for areas where perhaps moisture might be getting into the building. And this could be something that's just, based on age, based on deterioration. It could also be due to a storm event, right? So we want to be cognizant of that. And, perhaps we need to do a visual assessment after a significant storm event. We've had unprecedented hurricane season, for example, in Florida. So, should your property be in the path of hurricane damage or high winds or, some of these other type of environmental and storm related conditions, then you would want to do a visual assessment after the storm is passed and understand if there is any damage and if any repairs need to be made. And so we would walk the exterior. We're looking for evidence of any ponding or standing water. We're looking for water that's accumulated at all. If it's getting close to the foundation, then we have concerns it might be infiltrating into the basement of the building, as an example. We'd want to look at any heavy vegetation growth. Sometimes where I live, we have a lot of old trees, and so there's a concern, especially in storm events. These trees have come down, that they've hit the roof, they've broken windows, those kinds of things. So we want to make sure we're cognizant of that. And if there's heavy vegetation that's around the foundation of the building, a lot of times, again, that traps moisture and starts to infiltrate into the basement and get into the building. We'd look for any staining to our building envelope. Do we see any evidence of moisture that's accumulated or damaged the building? And then we want to look if there's any deterioration to the flashing along the roof line, around the perimeter of each window, and around the perimeter of the doors. After we've done a thorough site walk visually on the exterior, we'll turn our attention to the interior. And similarly, we're looking for evidence of moisture-related staining, any wet areas, any pooled or accumulated water, whether it's pooled in the carpet, if we see damaged ceiling tiles that look like they've been wet, anything that might have blistered the paint, or any of the wall coverings, whether that's draperies or perhaps you have some wallpaper, anything like that, even window shades, something like that. We'd want to make sure that we're looking at all of those kinds of interior materials that could possibly be either stained or actively wet and holding moisture. We'd look again, any blistering that tells us that water buildup has been accumulating. We'd look for rust deposits or rust stains, whether that's following, the flashing, whether it's coming from any interior wallboard, any of the metal connections there, any areas where we might have rust, on metal. We want to look for that also. And then finally, we're looking for condensation or mold growth. Especially we want to look at the heating, ventilation, air conditioning, cooling units, right? May or may not, again, be storm damaged. Maybe the units have just stopped working. Maybe they've failed for whatever reason. Maybe they've reached the end of their estimated useful life. So we'd want to get a handle on what's the condition of the HVAC equipment, what's its age. And as part of a property condition assessment, we often will figure out what are the capital costs associated if those units in fact need to be repaired and or replaced. What might be the cost? Are we doing more maintenance, or are we planning or forecasting that we're going to need to replace them? And then we would put together a table, a capital needs table, and estimate over time what those costs might be. So perhaps, in our example at our property, maybe we determine that they've been well maintained, but those units are maybe getting to the end of their estimated useful life. So we might forecast, say, in years 2 or 3, 4 or 5, whatever it seems to work out to be, we would then estimate that we need to do an HVAC replacement in, say, years 2 or 3, something like that. And again, we're looking for visible evidence of mold. So, where there's moisture and humidity, there goes the mold growth. So we'd want to keep an eye out for that for sure. And I just have a quick note here. Certain states do have specific licensure requirements, and we want to make sure that we're cognizant of that, and that if you're bringing in a specialty contractor, that they have the appropriate licensure. This would be another place for you to keep good documentation. You want to make sure that you have that information, and that is part of the report that they provide to you. You might ask for it as part of, say, a proposal, that you want evidence of the appropriate licensure. And similarly for asbestos related work and lead paint work as well. Next slide, please. Great. So let's talk a little bit about the value of moisture mapping and the importance of good field documentation. So 2 things that we really want to get a handle on from moisture mapping is relative humidity and temperature. And the measurements of relative humidity are useful for us to assess potential contribution of that high humidity to mold growth in the building. So it's an indicator, it's a tool that we can use. This handheld device is a tool that we can use to gather relative humidity data and help us understand if in fact we might have conditions favorable to mold growth. We know some commercial building owners set their HVAC equipment to cease operations, say overnight or weekend hours or something like that, maybe more so, say, in an office setting or a manufacturing setting versus a residential setting. But, that does happen. And so there might be different reasons why we change the HVAC equipment settings for different hours of the day. But also, more importantly, as we were talking about a moment ago, should there be a storm event, should we lose power, then our HVAC equipment is no longer working. And so again, in a relatively high humidity environment, combined with moisture, then we start to have the risk of microbial growth. So we want to be cognizant of that, and especially after a storm event, make sure that we're taking appropriate steps using handheld meters such as the one pictured here to get that relative humidity data and try to understand if in fact we have a risk of mold growth. What we'd like to do is maintain that relative humidity below 60%. That's sort of a threshold point where we start to see it. So you might know US EPA makes a recommendation that we try to keep relative humidity between 30 and 50%. And that's kind of an optimal range to prevent mold growth. Thank you so much. Another handheld device that we use is a moisture meter. Sometimes you'll hear it called a wood moisture equivalent or material specific meter. And this is a way for us, again, to look at the interior building materials and say, are we in fact retaining or are the building materials soaking up moisture that they're collecting from the air, from storm events, that kind of thing. So using one of these, again, handheld device, a lot of times, facility maintenance staff might have and operate one of these, keep it on hand and utilize it again. If there's been a storm event, if there's been a power outage, if there's been a reason to think that maybe the HVAC isn't performing as its function, it dictates as it's optimal. So they're all a little bit different, but they essentially are looking to help us gauge moisture in building materials. And so you might need to calibrate it before you use it. They come with good, pretty easy to follow instructions. But the idea is to separate out, any moisture in wood products where we know it can grow, but then also other materials, for example, like wallboard, the surfacing material that's so common in many of our apartments. There's different ways to use this, but it's a quick survey, a quick gauge to give us an indication of what's the moisture condition beneath that surface, that immediate surface of the building materials. And it can be very precise, and we can make it specific to our area. And so we'll talk in a minute about how we gather this data, and then we put it in our moisture map. We could go to the next slide, please. Great. So here's our moisture map. So we want to determine how far water has spread both horizontally and vertically, and to what extent those materials are wet. To what degree are they holding moisture? It is a good visual tool for the client to be able to see, whoever we're trying to convey this information to. At least I know in my house, I have a couple of visual learners. It makes a big difference, I think, to be able to see the representation. How far has this water spread throughout the building, horizontally, vertically? So on the floor, up the walls, maybe coming in from the roof, down the walls, those kinds of things. Maybe if a pipe has burst, for example, maybe it's, following the trail of that pipe throughout the building. So we want to use that visual tool, and then gathering all this information, this moisture map can be used as part of a remediation plan should there need to be building materials that are removed from the property and properly disposed and then replaced. So it's, again, great visual tool, really helps us, and it helps us look at those building materials and helps us to calculate and establish a remediation plan and the costs associated with doing that work. Your floor plan could be hand-drawn. It doesn't have to be fancy. I'm going to show you a quick example of, a CAD digitized version, but certainly it can be a sketch of the property, whatever's going to work for you, just to convey, again, how far vertically and horizontally has that moisture spread throughout the building. Next slide, please. Great. So again, oftentimes this moisture intrusion is due to envelope leaks, as we talked about at the beginning. Is it coming in through the roof, through the windows, through the doorways, that kind of thing, but also, again, for storm events. If it's a wind-driven rain, then we might see it start to come through exterior surfaces of the wall. So we want to be sensitive to that, if there's actual damage, structural damage to the wall, or if maybe the flashing was not correctly installed. So it might reveal to us in a storm event, maybe some deficiencies in the building that we know now we need to correct. So the visual inspection and using a moisture meter and those kinds of tools can really help you to gather the information that you need. And as it says here, even a really well-built building, it does sometimes deteriorate, or it starts to, lose some of its integrity, its tightness. And so that's when we start to see moisture creeping into the building. Next slide, please. So let's just do a broad background. Again, I know we have a broad audience here, so I want to touch on some more things related to mold, as well as asbestos-containing building materials and lead paint, and give you some visuals of the kind of things that we'd be looking for. So more about mold, we know that mold spores are ubiquitous. They're found indoors, they're found outdoors. Sometimes you'll hear people refer to it as a fungus. The exposure to mold is unavoidable because, of course, it's a natural process. But to the extent possible in a residential setting, in a multifamily setting, we want to try to minimize human exposure where we can to mold. And although we know that they're present outdoors and indoors, on the interior and the interior surfaces, then we have more concern about that. And so there's lots of different standards that we can use, guidelines that we can use, but there's no regulatory standard for mold exposure. I personally am a very allergic person to mold. So if I walk into a building, I almost immediately react. My eyes water. I start to feel that itchy, scratchy throat, allergic feeling. But other people don't. And so that's also, I think, something that's a little bit tricky is that different people respond differently to mold growth. But I personally am an allergic person. So I feel it right away. But other people aren't. So I guess that's maybe part of the reason why we don't have a regulatory standard, but we do use ANSI guidelines and others. We just want to be careful where we can to minimize it. We know we can't eliminate all of it. It certainly grows sometimes in our bathrooms, below the kitchen sink, that kind of thing. But to the extent possible, we want to try to minimize it and mitigate it. If it gets out of control, if it's a proliferation of mold growth, then we really know we have a bigger issue, a bigger concern. So in the picture here, we see that mold is coming from the bottom and growing up the wallboard, it's expanding. And the thing is, it loves to eat that cellulose, that fiber, like the mold thrives in an environment like that where it can just grow and grow and grow. So should we find it, should we identify it through our visual inspection, using our moisture meter, and possibly through olfactory senses, if you have, the reaction to the mold that I do, we want to make sure that we take care of it because it will get worse and not get better. That's the problem, so we need to think about abating a condition such as that. And one quick solution often is making sure we stop the moisture from coming in and then starting the drying process. And then if we need to, replacing the building materials, such as the wallboard in this example. Next. Great. And let's talk a little bit about asbestos containing materials. Asbestos is a fibrous material. It occurs naturally in many parts of the world. And for a very long period of time, it was considered a wonder material. It has properties that make it very favorable, such as on building exteriors as roofing shingles, for example, and exterior cladding shingles on buildings. It's very durable. Those fibers don't burn. So there's lots of reasons why asbestos was used so broadly in so many capacities. Some of you may be familiar, for example, with transit pipe. It was a very durable way to transport materials through pipe, water and other solutions through piping that would last seemingly forever. So it has a lot of intrinsic value. The problem is, although it's got all this value in decorative finishes, in ceiling tiles, added to paints, exterior shingles that we talked about a second ago, really durable floor tile that can take a lot of use, say in a commercial kitchen or again in a residential setting with a lot of use, a lot of tenants, for example. Although it has a lot of intrinsic value there, it has the health effects that we'll talk about in just a second. And so because of those health concerns, only licensed professionals can collect samples for asbestos. So this would be another area where I would say, if you're having someone come in, you want to make sure that you verify that they have the appropriate licensure to do sampling and abatement. And these are just, again, a couple of visual examples of the types of materials. You might also see it as pipe wrap, for example, in a boiler room. Again, it's a great insulating material. It's a wonder material, but it does cause, unfortunately, health effects. Great. Can we talk for a minute about lead paint? I think it's really important, again, especially in a multifamily setting where we have children. It's our understanding from HUD data that over 62,000 units nationwide need lead abatement, meaning lead paint is known to be present. And so that's a pretty significant number. Related to that, we know that means that more than 90,000 children who are in Section 8 housing have been exposed and have lead poisoning. And so unfortunately, we feel that more guidance is needed. The jurisdiction maybe need more lead abatement grants. We know the public housing authorities maybe aren't catching this or identifying it and able to eliminate lead hazards. So the first step is definitely awareness. And then following some of the steps we've been talking about today, really getting that visual assessment, having someone who is licensed to do lead-based paint sampling come in, and then develop an appropriate physical inspection procedure that's going to work, and then once it's identified, have it properly abated. And again, it needs to be abated by someone with the appropriate licensure, which varies from state to state. So again, we want to be very careful about lead paint handling. We know that even lead dust causes some of the most hazardous exposure for children. And so that's a big concern. A common example is the use when lead paint was applied to windows and the sash around the window. And then when the windows are used frequently and that friction, it creates lead dust. And so it's very easily exposed to children as a respiratory issue. And what's terrible about it is that it caused these terrible adverse effects, such as brain damage, damage to our central nervous system. It can even cause slowed growth and development. And oftentimes, I think what brings it to the forefront is learning and behavioral problems. That's sometimes how it manifests most commonly, where it starts to get identified and people start to realize there's a problem. So we really want to be sensitive to lead paint handling. And so good best management practices for lead paint would mean conducting regular inspections, conducting a risk assessment, making sure if there is identified lead, that it's disclosed to the tenants at the property, that they are aware. And then having oversight, proper oversight for lead paint abatement. Again, it should be part of timely and routine visual assessments. There should be abatement that's conducted in the appropriate manner. There's steps that need to be taken. Again, that lead dust is such a it spreads so easily, and it's easily to be breathed in the respiratory space. So we want to make sure that that abatement has a containment system, that it's not exposed, distributed through other units, that it's really contained. And one thing that I want to remind everyone is that although it might have been kind of acceptable practice years ago to paint over lead paint, we know that that's not an acceptable practice anymore. And so if in fact lead is identified, then that lead should be properly abated and removed. And, depending on the extent and what's happening, it might require that the entire window sash, for example, be removed, replaced, that type of thing. And, maybe that ties into some other capital planning that you might have for the property. So, we want to look at it holistically, but we want to also keep a keen focus on both being responsive to the regulatory framework that we need to abide by in our community, and also making sure that we're so careful about the health effects. So if in fact any elevated blood levels are identified for children, there is a HUD reporting requirement and verification of those elevated cases. And also we want to make sure that if there's a lead-free environment, we communicate that as well. So, back to what we were talking about a little early, we want to always make sure that we're careful to document any abatement work that's done. We keep the records available and we communicate to any tenants. And there is a HUD hotline, so there's some numbers. There's lots of resources, and we'll share a few at the end as well if you need to do a little more research on this topic.
Actually, Elizabeth, if you could, we do have a question regarding the statistics that you did mention in there around the lead-based paint. So if you could provide some of your sources for that, that would be great as well. And we can get those sent out to everybody.
Absolutely. I would be happy to provide that. Thank you, Elizabeth. And there are a couple of resource materials at the end of the slide deck, so I'll be sure to get those out to you as well. Absolutely. I know our time is drawing short quickly, so I just want to make sure we cover review and reporting. As we've been talking about this afternoon, having a good visual of where the moisture infiltration is, again, whether it's wet carpet and the flooring, whether it's the wallboard, this is just an example, but having a schematic, some kind of visual representation, and then demarcating any abatement that needs to be done, any impacted building material that needs to be removed. We want to make sure that we're clear about that. We would follow a very similar process for not just moisture and mold, but also for asbestos, for also lead paint, right? So good documentation, have a good figure of the property, each unit, each floor, however it's appropriate in your setting to track this, but having good documentation is really imperative. maybe the next slide we could go to. Great. So just as an example, if you had, for example, an environmental consultant such as myself, or someone on your facilities team, they might generate a report that focuses on different areas of the building. I think it's incredibly powerful to have photo documentation, and this is really helpful as part of the overall documentation to be able to say, here's where we were before and here's where we are after. It's really helpful to be able to say, these are the steps that we've taken to identify our concern. This is the abatement that needed to occur. We've performed the abatement, and here's the documentation showing that the work has been done. So that can be very, very powerful to have those visual. And so just to point out, if you can see the blue lines, that blue tape, that demarcates the water level in the building. And so all of the wall board below that level needed to be replaced in this example. So helpful, again, once again, to have good documentation. That really is valuable. Next slide. Great. So there's some resources here that I hope that you'll find helpful. And I would be very happy to provide any additional that you might need. And of course, to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We do actually have one question, and it's regarding the requirements for lead paint mitigation. They're stating that painting over as abatement has been a practice for many housing authorities. Please let us know where this requirement is coming from. And I don't think they have updated the requirement. I think you're just stating that painting over it has not been identified as a clearly the best mitigation that we can be doing, because it does lend itself to having to be inspected all the time and repaired and constantly repaired. So I think you weren't stating that HUD has declared a regulation, just that it is more of a best practice to remediate, although it can be very costly.
Thank you. Yes, exactly, Elizabeth. I should have been more clear about that. Thank you for saying that. Absolutely. Yeah, I wanted to try to share with you some best practices, and you're exactly right. So while we might have done that in the past, especially with the friable dust that comes from asbestos, that comes from lead paint, and moving the windows up and down and up and down, if we add those extra layers of paint, it doesn't really solve our problem. So, thank you for clarifying that.
We tend to talk that way in the insurance industry as well, where we want to get to the root of the problem, but we do understand that the solution that we are suggesting can be quite costly at times. So we try to work with them as much as we can. Appreciate your session today. It was very informative. And I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.